Gonna give myself some tea. Hello to the nobody who's watching currently. Okay. Gonna give myself a big fuck of black. On the side. Kia ora to everyone who's watching. Still just waiting another couple of minutes for people to wander in. I'm once again drinking tea. I think it's getting to the stage where it's getting a wee bit colder, so I'm wearing a nominally long sleeve shirt, but one that is very warm and made of merino. I have my very thick lounge blanket on me. The lounge is just there. It's very close. I have a very large pot of tea that I'll be consuming. This I got for €2. It's a very impressive purchase, but it's a little bit cracked, so it leaves a small puddle of tea whenever you fill it up. Other changes: the plant has been changed. I think our chili plant is not doing too well in the cold weather, so we've just oh, thank you, Grace. We've updated the plant for one that's a little bit more camera ready and give our chili plant a little bit of time to soak up some sun on the other side of the kitchen. Very, very relaxed. Just a couple of drips of water on my laptop, but that's all good. If it gets particularly cold, I have a very large white jumper that I will put on, so I will look like the character from Knives Out. Grace, in fact, before she moved into the flat, sent me a Christmas card. In that Christmas card was a recommendation to watch Knives Out, which is a very good recommendation because Tara and I watched it together. It was very lovely. Is everyone else having nice halfway through lockdown celebrations? I had a big work conference call where everyone was very excited, but I don't think work is going to come back after the 2 weeks. So a little bit of a false celebration. Just going to start in 1 minute. That was slightly too warm. Some kids are chasing pigeons. It's very sweet. Neat. So 5 o'clock has gone. I reckon it's time to start the Thursday development session, which is very, very exciting. So as always, remember you can leave a comment. You can leave an anonymous comment. You can send a message to your friend on the exec and be like, please pass on to Daniel to talk about this particular thing. It can be a little bit tough to speak for 1 hour about an arcane bit of debating theory when I don't have examples to bounce off against or questions. So really, really like the questions. Chuck those in and we can have a chat about them. Today, we're discussing weighing. And you'll hear lots of words that roughly mean mean similar things, not necessarily the same thing, but are all about trying to build up the importance of your point within a debate. So some people call it relevance, some people call it impacting or weighing. We're going to go through these, because I think they're actually slightly different concepts. We're going to go through the different ways in which points can be made important within a debate, and make sure that we give you lots of practical examples about how to put it into your own debating. And note, this is not something you're going to spend a huge amount of time on in every debate. It tends to be something where simplicity and efficiency is a more effective way to do it than necessarily layering on the histrionics. But we're going to be giving you some of the solid foundations necessary to make your points feel more important within debates. I'm going to add two things before we jump into all of those ideas. The first is that, once again, there's Club Night tonight. Auckland Club Night is always popping. Live, we've had 1 or 2 clubs nights so far. I actually can't remember. But they've all been excellent, which is good. And this is also the last club night before Cinnamon Scroll. So if you are coming to Cinnamon Scroll, it's a really good opportunity to get acquainted with some of the other judges and speakers first up, but also to get acquainted with the technology, because obviously we're all facing a little bit of a transition here with how debating is going to operate when it moves into an online space. So if you are coming to Cinnamon Scroll, or in fact going to any online tournaments, would highly encourage you just to come along to Clubs Night to get a feel for how that stuff works. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a lot of the Zoom allocation and the Zoom work for Cinnamon Scroll itself, and to help me prepare for that, I'm going to be running all the allocations for Club Night tonight. So it will be very exciting to have lots of you along to give me a real taste of the horror that I have signed myself up for, but will be very fun. Question for my president: is the development session going live? Development session is live, to my understanding. Amba has just twigged that it is live. She did not get the notification, but good work following up. It's only like 3 minutes after the time that it should have gone. So that's like president onto it. And I hope she's tuned in now to hear me semi-roasting her on the live stream. Yeah, so if you're interested in Cinnamon Scroll, there's still a little bit of time if you wanted to trainee to get in touch with your exec from the particular campus you are. So if you're on the from Canterbury, get in touch with like Will Miller. If you're from Otago, get in touch with Joe Gary. From Vic, get in touch with Brooke. If you're from Auckland, get in touch with Amba. Like lots of different people you can chat to. We still have a couple of spaces left for trainees, so looking to bring people in. So if you're interested in that, make sure you come along. Okay, so before we get into weighing and how weighing operates, I think what might be useful is giving a little bit of an overview over the stuff we've already discussed in these live stream series, and then explain how weighing fits into those ideas that we've been discussing. So obviously you'll all remember from the first video, one of the most important things that I think needs to happen in debating, particularly when you are doing your preps, is to think about two things. You need to think about the comparative. What are the two things we're comparing in this debate? What are the two worlds? What are the two positions? What exactly does either team stand for? If you don't understand what both teams stand for, it's very difficult to win a debate. You can easily get outflanked. Then secondly, the framework. How should the judge be thinking about the debate? How should the judge be judging the debate? And then from that framework, normally your points will flow very naturally. You'll be like, okay, I think this thing is really important, so my first point is how do we achieve this thing? Often your framework helps you generate the points. That's why I think it's really good for prep. In the second seminar, we talked about speaker roles. And through the speaker roles, we also did a lot of discussion of the comparative and the framework. But what weighing is important for every single speaker within a debate. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, it's particularly important for leaders' replies or particularly important for third speeches. And though there is a slight shift in how much explicit weighing you do, because you've got more material on the table you can play with, you still need to be thinking as a first speaker and a second speaker about how do you make sure your points hold value within the debate? How do you push their relevance? How do you make sure that they're going to still stand at the end of the debate? And if you do that in a preemptive way, it's way easier for your second speaker and third speaker to be like, well, my first speaker did this, and I'm going to add this, this, and this. It just means that they have a lot more efficiency. They're able to do their job better. So you need to be thinking about weighing, impacting relevance of your points from the first moment of your prep all the way through each of the speeches, all the way to the leader's replies, and then hopefully in your feedback for your judge. Because if your judge has not discussed how they weighed points, they're probably engaged with the debate in a not particularly sophisticated way. In our third session, we discussed types of points, and we went through a whole different range. You have like your substantive and rebuttal points, often though the ones people think of, and then you have your issue or clash points. I think issue and clash points is particularly where the weighing aspect comes in, because you're trying to weigh things. But obviously, if you're bringing a substantive point, you want to make sure that it has impact, it has weight. If you're bringing a rebuttal point, you want to make sure you're attacking impact and weight. And I think that brings very neatly onto last session, which was responsiveness, how to engage with the case that another person has brought to you. And we spoke about at the end of the different things you should be thinking about when you're responding. We talked about attacking the impact of the opposition's points, and we talked about attacking the weight of opposition's points. So making sure that you can minimize their points or explain why their points are unimportant is an effective skill when responding to other speakers. So how does this seminar fit then in the arc of what you're going to be learning? It particularly relates to what happens at the end of your points or at the end of your speech. So obviously a lot of you will be competent at making the points, walking through the mechanism, saying that, oh, this is the context, this is the logic, here's what I think happens, and then very unsure how to then make sure that it sticks within the debate or has impact. So what we're discussing particularly here is that last stage: how do you make sure that your points have relevance, stick within the debate, are powerful? If you tuned in on Saturday to the Noise from the Bench live stream, you will have noticed we did already have some discussion of these ideas. How do you make sure points are relevant? And we had it particularly through a discussion of principled points. Do principled points have relevance? And we came to a rough consensus that the way in which you should think about principled points is A, something that proves an outcome. Principled points can't just sit there in the abstract. They're never going to be helpful, or they can help you think about your framework. And often what I like to think of was when you're impacting and weighing points, you are engaging a little bit with that principled mindset. You're asking yourself, what is valuable? Why should I care about things? All of those framework questions you discuss at the very beginning of your prep. So in the live stream of Noise from the Bench, I think two things were very useful and said by my co-hosts. One was from Grace Belworthy, and she told you that it's important to keep it short. This is something that I think, when done efficiently and effectively, can really take your debating to the next level. But if you over-labor the point, it often loses its sting, it loses its ability to have an impact within the debate. So make sure you keep these things short. You very sharply explain why it's relevant, very sharply compare it to the other team's relevance, and moving forward. Joe said that there's a lot of discussion of words that may not be as popular in the South Island. So he pointed to example the way that I use impacting and weighing. And I apologized because I think I was using it a little bit imprecisely. When I talk about impacting and when I talk about weighing, I'm actually talking about slightly different things. And what Joe wanted to say was relevance is actually built into by those two things. So let's walk through how we get relevance and what is the difference between impacting and weighing. Your impacting is about explaining all of the different ways in which your point mechanistically has outcomes that are significant. So not about whether or not the debate, the point fits into your framework of the debate or how it overall affects the debate. What you're showing is that your point has potency, that it's something that prima facie is a big effect, is a strong effect, is something that should be cared about, that's not just a wash within the debate. Teams need to be careful about making this more when they go overseas than in New Zealand, because overseas, judges have a much stronger tendency to discount material that is well made and well explained, but hasn't been impacted appropriately, hasn't been explained what the actual specific outcomes are or why those outcomes have particular potency. I have lost many debates to Australians because they take my well-crafted points and be like, but Daniel missed this key step because I was probably a little bit lazy or because I wasn't quite sure how to phrase it, and then they're able to run away with the debate. So I think this is quite a difficult skill. I think it still needs to be done efficiently, so don't over-labor it, but is something that is important, particularly if you're going overseas. So what are ways in which you can make sure that a point has impact? I break this down into roughly 5 or 6 different things I like to think about. And remember from last session when we discussed the way I like to have like a whole bunch of things I'm thinking about, but in a debate I'll very rarely go through, and this is how to fix this, and this is how to fix this, this is how to fix this. When you're doing training, it's about building these skills intuitively into how you understand debating and how you're able to pull it out with ease. So when I'm thinking about impacting points, I think about these things. Firstly, I think about the certainty of the outcome. I think teams, especially when they're younger, they tend to think of points in rather a binary. Either I won this point or I didn't win this point. When in reality, that's not especially true. Often you're dealing with a risk of something occurring, and you need to explain how that risk is going to be something that's meaningful. And an example that I'll give is an Australs debate I did with Karan and Zach that was about basically the seizing of control of Kashmir by the Indian government, taking away some of the protections they previously had. One of the points that we argued in that debate is that there would be a risk of increasing the odds of more tension with Pakistan, which can increase the risk of war, which to the worst creates the risk of a nuclear war, and that's obviously an incredibly bad outcome. So what I think was very useful feedback we got from the judge is the judge was like, that could happen, but there's no effort in explaining to me how likely it was to happen, and so that makes it more difficult for me to credit it as a point within the debate. So if you're building, for example, a particularly large harm that has a low risk of happening, which often happens particularly in debates about like nuclear energy or in like nuclear weapons, but hey, also happens a lot in debates about like health and pandemics. Like this is a once in a many generations outcome. There was a very low chance of there being a pandemic, but the fact that we haven't prepared for it is obviously very devastating in a lot of areas. When you're thinking about making those very high impact points that have low certainty, build that into your analysis, explain, hey, it's got a low certainty, but if it does happen, it's catastrophic, and unlikely things happen all the time, therefore this should be built into your calculus. That's quite a sophisticated way of making a point, but if you don't explicitly engage with the certainty of the point, it becomes easy for otherwise well-made points to be discounted as too unlikely or too far outside of how normal policymakers would be making decisions, and therefore not given credit in the debate. So one, certainty. Second thing I like to ask is how widespread. How many people does it affect? How many institutions does it affect? How many people live within this particular ambit that we're caring about? I think this is a very underrated point, because often when you are comparing different impacts that are both bad, so you're going to be choosing between one bad thing or another bad thing, you need to be clear about how many people it affects, and you need to do this in a comparative way. Say, even if they prove this point, which often they'll be able to do, our point is still has more impact because it affects a larger range of people. The neat corollary of that, and the third thing I like to think about, is how severely does it impact those people? And obviously, there can often be a trade-off here. So you can have a point that affects a very wide range of people, but affects them in a relatively mild way, or you could have a point that affects very few specific people and affects them particularly strongly or particularly harshly. So sometimes there's a trade-off, and you need to explicitly engage in the comparative as to why you think it's worth making one trade-off or another, but it adds to the nuance, it adds to the flavor and richness of your point if you're able to articulate both how many people you think are likely to be affected and how severely you think it's likely to be affected. The third thing I think about, if you think about like the how severely as a how much does X thing impact the average person, also think about whether the group that is being hit, it has unique vulnerabilities that make an ordinary impact on individuals particularly more dangerous. And I like to think about this kind of in a fragile skull way, and this is a legal concept. Oh fuck, it's starting to rain. I'll think if it gets worse. So they'll be thinking in a thin skull way of thinking about things, where even if the force that is applied to the same people, like an equal breach of privacy, an equal violation, if we're another point, for some people who have, say, weaker defenses against that thing, it may have a particularly severe impact. So also think about the unique vulnerabilities of your target group, and that's the fourth thing I think about. The fifth thing I think is actually a very useful way to broaden your analysis and debate is to think about time. How does this affect things over a broad range of time? Is it very concentrated? How long-lasting are the effects? That adds value in terms of whether you think the point is going to have particular impact beyond just the narrow scope of, and I think it's particularly useful in BP. If your two teams talk in the very short term as opening, you can bring that long-term perspective. So think about how long something lasts. And then the final thing to think about is about then built into weighing, and that's how many people, that's how it fits into your broader framework. So I am just going to abandon my outdoor haunt and go inside. Ooh, it has started to rain. Okay, so you will get to watch me move in some furniture, which will be a very exciting thing for you.
You right?
Nah, all good.
Sure need help?
Nah, all good. You can see how we set up the show in reality.
So another helpful window and bathroom. It's a little bit, you don't need to put a little bit of work.
You'll recognize this side, this backdrop from Noise from the Bench.
And if you don't recognize it, then
The forecast lied to me. Very sad. Thank you. Right. Oh. Yeah. While you're thinking, leave a comment. Okay, start one more one. So, now we know that a transition inside can be made relatively painless. So we just moved the entire set inside. Very exciting. Okay, so if you have questions about impacting those 5 things that I talked about, make sure you leave a comment or make sure you leave a response in the online section, and we can get into those specifics of how they operate later. So no comments as of yet, so I'll go on to talking about weighing. When you think about weighing a point, always tie it back to the framework that you set up for how to judge the debate. And remember, you're going to be wanting to do this from the very earliest stages of your prep time. You're going to be wanting to think, what is important within this debate? How do I make the judge care about it? Sometimes this will be discussed as like a principled framework or a principled point, and I'd encourage you not to adopt that specific framing. Always be very clear about exactly what the impact of the point is going to be, how it changes the way the judge should judge the debate, and avoid language that suggests that your point is only abstract or is only principled. Because some judges, particularly unsophisticated judges, won't be able to tell the difference, and they'll want to discriminate against that point because they'll just be like, oh, it's another dumb principle point. So you don't want to leave them any room to do that. You want to be very clear about what you're doing with the point, and that is how the framework operates. So weighing is just saying, okay, if you think that these 2 things are proved within this debate, here's how you should compare them relative to that overall framework that has been set up. So it's often a very simple thing to do, but is missed by teams because either they haven't put the work in establishing what they need to do to win in terms of establishing how principally the debate should be judged. And if they miss doing that, it makes their points overall kind of adrift and at risk of being outflanked by a sophisticated other team who's able to argue in a much more framework-based way how the judge should judge the debate. So that's what we mean by weighing. And I'll go through an example now just to make it very clear about how these things operate. But before that, I'll jump into some of the responses that we got. And the first is, what do you mean by framework? So that was exactly what I was discussing before. A framework is something that explains to the judge how they think how you think they should be judging. And often that's by like picking a particular group that you just think is more impacted by, a particular point that you think has the most impact. That's the most ordinary framework, just like how much good or how much harm does something do? At its basis, like most debates are about that, and most of us adopt a very standard, do I think this causes more harm to more vulnerable people who we care about more type of framework. But you can add more sophisticated layers in explaining how particular points operate. And the way I like to think about it is sometimes points are like a chain that leads you to an outcome you want within the debate, victory within that debate. So you have to prove each of those points. Those points build one on the other to get that outcome. Or sometimes you'll take a wider approach where instead of having one chain, where if one of those links fails, you're not able to win the debate, you have multiple avenues towards winning the debate. That's how you contrast those 2 different approaches within a case. So I would, in your framework, be quite explicit about that to the judge. Be honest and be like, we win this debate if we're able to prove either this or either this, and then explain how you've got 2 paths to victory there, or explain, I think we win this debate if we're able to prove this overall thing. We achieve that by proving this thing, and this thing. So you need to have those win conditions in mind. You need to have that framework in mind for the judge in order then to make points that can have the most weight and relevance and importance within the debate. So the second question we got is what is a principled point, what are other types of points. Note here there's a lot of crossover between the way that these points operate because the labels that people use don't match exactly what they want to come out of that point. At its worst, a principled point is a point that doesn't have any impact. Normally it's just an appeal to people's biases. It's an appeal to how they think the world should operate. So even if we aren't able to explain to you why it's good or bad, you should still go along with it. That is very ineffective in debating and is often a waste of time. So never be like, it's the principle of the thing that matters. Be like, you have to explain how it has outcomes. As we discussed in Noise the Bench, I think there's two useful ways to think about like useful principle points. One's that framework we were talking about. How do you have what should we value within the debate? Why should we care about one outcome over another outcome? You need to do the work behind that, and that's often what's discussed as weighing. And then the other type is basically like a very sophisticated practical point that attempts to make slightly diffuse harms, but make those diffuse harms actually real. So you still are linking it to an outcome. You're just discussing it with the language of principle, which can sometimes be ineffective because it creates that confusion. So be very clear about the outcomes you're producing. That should probably be contrasted with your typical like outcome-based point, like what people at schools tend to refer to as a practical point. All of your points should have realistic outcomes. So this should be basically all of your points, and then of course, you have like context points, which are really about like painting a world, and you have like impact points, which are about explaining why one particular thing has such a particular effect. But when we start breaking it down to that level, often you'll be doing those things within one broad like practical point. You'll have your context, you'll have your mechanisms, and you'll have your impact. So make sure that you have all those things within a point. If you decide to split it in three, you're necessarily going to be adopting a relatively narrow set of pathways that you can use to win the debate. Okay, so we'll dive into a quick walkthrough of an example and how to think about weighing that example within a debate. So let's take the example of the legalization of drugs, as we discussed in the last session. So if you were saying, I want to legalize drugs because I think the war on drugs is particularly bad, and has horrible consequences. So you've made that point well, you've explained how police violence operates, you've explained how it leads to incursions from the surveillance state, you've explained how it's often poor people, well, actually no, you haven't done the debate, but you've explained the mechanism of how the war on drugs works, and say you're also able to clearly show mechanisms behind why the same thing doesn't happen when you abolish it. Like, so you've been able to explain why it only exists in a world where you get rid of those drugs. Because remember, you have to be thinking about that comparative. Let's go through all the different things that are important to giving a point impact and weight within a debate, and how they would apply. So first thing's certainty. You will have made a set of claims within assessing your point, and at that stage you need to be really realistic about how certain it is. And I think the way you do it in this debate is to be like, it won't happen in every case. Some cases are unique where the gangs are particularly entrenched and would lead to certain bad outcomes, but what we know is over a broad range of the rest of the things, it's very likely to have this impact. We've seen it in this example, I've seen an example, I've seen it in this example. Basically what that's saying is quantifying for the judge how likely you think something's going to happen, and making it clear that you believe your point is very certain, just in case the opposition tries to paint your point as being like a moonshot, very unlikely, like the point that we brought in that Australs debate about nuclear war with Pakistan potentially breaking out. So you need to be honest about the certainty of that point. The second thing you say is how many people will this impact? So you'd be like, the war on drugs impacts a huge range of people across these long supply chains. And so if we were to decrease the war on drugs, you're necessarily going to have flow-on effects, not just to the people who are engaged in the coca trade themselves, but also their families. Also making sure that there's ways to make that point widespread and add nuance there into making the debate affect more. And note, you need to do it in a comparative way. So if they're able to prove that, yes, some people would still have drug overdoses, because say like they've been able to win that point, you say, well, we think that this affects more people because a smaller percentage of people take the drugs and a much larger group of people are involved in this production, not necessarily by their own choice. Then if we think about how severely something is going to happen, we're going to think, well, for some people who are like smoking marijuana, the impact is like maybe some people will have a bad impact because they'll increase their consumption of marijuana, but the real severe harm is the people who get arrested. The real severe harm is people who die in like gunfights on the Colombian border. That's a particularly severe harm. That's something we should care about a lot. Then we think about unique vulnerability. You can explain people who consume drugs, often in the West, have access to a lot more healthcare, a lot more services. They tend to be better taken care of. And even if they are drug addicts for a certain period of their life, they often have support to get their lives back on track. Compare this to the people who are sacrificed in the war against drugs. They tend to be people from places who are way more vulnerable. They tend to have way less choice and be way more like exposed to violence. And the communities that tend to be targeted by the war on drugs with things like possession, we only lock up the people who are most vulnerable already, not the people who are rich, because we know that white and rich people tend to get away with drug consumption way more than people who are poor and people who are minorities. So thinking about that unique vulnerability. And then finally, how long does it last? Once again, comparative, you'll be like, when you put someone in prison, you don't just impact them, you also think about their kids, people who come after them, the communities that decrease their resilience. That's something that is bad. That's something that hurts these communities intergenerationally. That's something we should compare about a lot. Note, I spent probably a little bit too much time fleshing out each of these things. You're going to want to build them into quite a continuous line to give them a lot of impact within the debate. So if I were to do that quite quickly, I'd be like, we need to legalize we need to legalize drugs to end the war of drugs, because we know that the war of drugs is hurting many people and that decreasing it will take away the power of the state to oppress these people. We know it affects a lot of people down supply chains that cross different borders. We know that those people are impacted incredibly severely because they die, they're put in prison, they have their lives taken away from them. And these are groups that are particularly vulnerable because they tend to be poorer, they tend to have less access to resources relative to the other people who would be dealing with. And we know that it impacts them intergenerationally. They're never able to escape the way that their communities are unable to escape the way that this has impact on them. So if you see there, you'll have this written down at the end of your point, just how do you tie it all together and make me care specifically about that group of people who are being impacted, care about the outcome of that point. And note, you're going to want to specifically do this in a comparative way. You're going to want to be explaining how the points that have been proved by the opposition could not stack up with the impact we have within this debate. Then, once you've done the impacting stage of explaining why your point is relevant, you jump down to the weighing aspect. And this is explaining the framework. This is explaining how the point has weight within the framework that you've set up for the debate. So the question there is saying, why should I care about this particular outcome relevant to how you've set up the debate? And if it's a debate about the legalization of drugs, you may think two things. Firstly, is the very normal harm calculus. We should care about this thing because it's a way more all of the other stuff that I talked about, and the goodness that comes out of it is way outweighs the badness that they've been able to prove. So that's the very simple trade-off. I'm making it very explicit to the judge that your point is more important than the opposition's. A more sophisticated lens that can be taken is that we should care particularly about people who haven't made the decision to get themselves in the problems that they're dealing with. So you could weight particularly the risk that some people in the rich world will die of overdoses, and them choosing to engage in starting to take the drugs, the fact that rich college kids might be impacted harmfully. We care less about that, not because the impact is lesser on them, but because they don't fit within our framework of what we should care about within the debate. So that's how you can add another framework lens and then explain how within the debate, even if they've proved that an impact is particularly severe, why we shouldn't care about it as much within the broader framework that we've established. And then, of course, the last thing to do is to explain the impact, the relevance of that broader point to coming to your end decision. So explaining the war on drugs is such an important point within this debate that even if we lose all of the rest of the points within this debate, we still think we're able to win, because giving a realistic, and I think obviously the war on drugs is an enormous impact, a very tough thing to think about. So you're going to be wanting to have that very specific lens, very specific explanation as to why your point has that impact on the overall debate. Cool. Any more questions? Sorry for the abrupt set change. Joe and Grace are cooking something that smells amazing.
It's feta and spinach quiche.
Grace just said it's a feta and spinach quiche. Was very wet. I'll just have a chill for 5-10 minutes. So if you have questions, flick a question either on the Facebook video or to the anonymous forum that's in the little live stream description.
We're not going to use this on the
Mm-hmm. I hope you're excited for Cinnamon Scroll. I think it'll be very fun. Also, international viewers, we have a surprising amount of people from overseas who watch. If I ever discuss something that's too New Zealand specific, just flick a little comment through and I'll explain the relevance of that, because obviously I come from a particular cultural perspective that makes things that seem very obvious and normal to me not obvious and normal to other people. People too from particularly different debating circuits. And come to Cops Night. It'll be very fun.
On Twitter, I didn't see anything.
Oh, that's right. That was like to one of the group chat, Jamie and and stuff came for a video session virtual pub trip at some point tonight. I said that sounds good. I think much in the team will be handled tonight because for a couple of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The Thursday before Easter, the last couple of years, people got absolutely wrecked.
Yep.
For kind of Lenten reasons.
Oh, I like this.
And the other reason is that you know what's happening with
Cool. Any last thoughts?
Dan Fincher's work.
Flick in a comment, flick in a question. Ooh, question. As a third speaker, should I spend more time weighing or rebutting material? I always struggle to get that balance right. I think that's a very good question, and you need to ask yourself a set of strategic questions. So the first strategic question is, how likely am I to beat this point? And to beat a point means you explain why the logic is faulty, or to explain why the outcome doesn't, the outcome doesn't flow as they expected to, or the context is different, such in a way that the whole point dematerializes. And that means that the outcome won't happen within the debate, and therefore cannot be weighed. So if you think that's possible, and as a third speaker, you normally will have gotten to a stage within the debate where it's quite clear how much you think they'll be able to prove in that, do that, add that extra rebuttal. That's very important and very compelling. The second thing that you need to ask is, can I rebut this in a way that decreases the overall impact? So say you're not trying to knock out a point completely, but you can still minimize that point. You can add bits of justification, or you can add bits of explanation that decrease the overall impact of that point. That's something that you should be thinking about, and that'll often be considered a rebuttal section. So if you deal with all of the rebuttal stuff in terms of, I think the point doesn't work, if you deal with all the rebuttal stuff in terms of, I don't think the impact is what they claim it is, it's not as widespread, it's not as severe, it's not as XXXXX, then thirdly, the third thing you think about is, how do I minimize the importance of this within a debate? So generally, I would do all three when I'm speaking third, and you build it into your introduction, you build it in throughout your speech, adding that slant towards particular outcomes being important within the framework that you've built for the adjudicator. And so it's necessarily a balance of where you think that time is more effectively spent. And often, I would just encourage you, if you cannot beat a point and you're just wasting time saying things that you don't that just like are implausible, you don't think the judge will buy it, spend more time minimizing the impact of it within the debate, rather than throwing away time trying to rebut like really obvious prescriptions that are otherwise true. And if you build into your mind that I need to deal with the impact, then I need to deal with the weight, it becomes quite easy to think about the three things you need to do: rebutting the impact, explaining why it doesn't have weight within the debate, and integrate those in ways that are clear to the judge. So obviously there's going to be a little bit of a balance there, and you just have, it's one of those things that you just have to do more debating, figure out more, am I doing too much of one thing, too little of another thing, but it will be quite debate specific. I think you do need to be rebutting the impact and rebutting the like the weighting within a debate. So don't have all of your time spent on rebutting. That's often a note of someone who doesn't have a lot of experience within debating, haven't built in those even if arguments, those explanations of, okay, even if they are able to prove that logic, why don't you still allow them to win the debate? And it'll just add a huge amount to how your points come across and how they play out in the end consequences of the debate. Cool. How do you weigh points in a leader's reply? I love leader's replies. I think they are excellent. The first thing that I think about is, once again, what is my framework for winning the debate? What plus what equals me winning? Have I run points that are dependent on one another or dependent on some bit of context that's all about winning that particular bit of context? Or are they multiple pathways to victory that I just need to plug in what's most appropriate? So in terms of the specifics of how you weigh things in a leader's reply, I don't think it's particularly different in the actual process of weighing. You still want to explain it relative to that framework. You still want to be going through why the impacts that you are building are more important than the impacts in another debate, but it'll just be your entire speech. So you need to be like, so the way I set up my points when I'm doing a leader's reply is I'll say, I'll have my points of clash. My points of clash will normally lead to the outcome within the debate. If they win these 3 points of clash, they win the debate. If we win XYZ points of clash, we are able to win this debate. Even if we lose this point of clash, we're still able to win this debate. So have that strategic mindset. And then you go specifically with the comparative and you say, this is what they wanted to prove within this debate. This is what they did prove within this debate. So filling in the rebuttal and filling in the impact. This is how it fits within the framework. Do we think it's important or not? And then compare. This is what we wanted to prove within this debate. This is what we did prove within this debate. Goes into certainty, severity, all those things we talked about. And then comparing those two things, the reason why our material has more justification within the debate, more relevance within the debate is, and then you'll just point to the key bits that you're able to make. Because sometimes they'll make a point that seems really clever and it's really well explained, but because they've missed something about the framework or something about the comparative, it doesn't have much weight within the debate. And so you'll be able to point that out there. So in leader's reply, always comparative, going through in a very thorough, methodical way gives a lot of strength and structure to your case. My flatmates are making banana bread. It's so exciting. So it's really unnerving. Facebook Live has made me updates to their new version of doing it, and it keeps flashing as though like the screen is turning off. And I'm like, oh my god, did the water get into my laptop? But no, I just think it's their new way of imposing. They've nudged me into making this. They slowly made it impossible for me to use the old version. Apologies for the brief rain delay. The rain has stopped now, but the floor is wet, and the sky is very grey, as you can see. And after that brief weather interlude, I think at this point I'm going to say goodbye to you and start preparing for the next glorious club night that Auckland EBSOC is hosting. So yes, remember, if you're keen, still time to sign up for club night. Still time to trainee at Cinnamon Scroll if you are interested. We would love to have you at both of these events, and I hope you have a beautiful weekend, regardless of whether you're debating or not.